On the last episode of the Keepsake box, David walked away. I experienced a wide array of emotions in that moment. To date, I still don't know which one was the most poignant. I was hurt, confused, and angry. David hadn't ever spoken to me in that manner, and he certainly hadn't ever struck me. Juanita and I looked at each other, both stunned. With no clear understanding of why the situation transpired as it had, I cried and apologized to Juanita. She was uncomfortable, and I couldn't blame her. I made sure to tell her that the episode wasn't indicative of how David and I usually lived. Juanita hugged me and told me that it was okay. I didn't realize how much of an ally that she would end up being. Now, let's have a quick sidebar. Present day, I'm fully aware that I'd experienced something that I would come to know well, a narcissistic episode. But at the time, I only felt hurt that was laced with guilt. I hadn't ever experienced that with David. And because it was in such stark contrast to how David usually behaved, I began to wonder if I had indeed crossed the line. He wouldn't have been so angry otherwise, right? Wrong. The average person wouldn't ever have drawn a correlation between my meddling in our friends' affairs and my ability to be an effective guardian. Simply put, one thing had nothing to do with the other. But I would learn that it was his way. If ever anything went outside of David's favor, there was always a punishment to be assessed. And it wasn't enough to just divvy out a punishment. David also tried to remind me that I wasn't on his level. My upbringing and lack of paternal presence had nothing to do with my decision to converse with Tina, a fact that David was very much aware of. What potential benefits would I have received from systematically breaking up successful family units? Absolutely none. But none of that mattered. It worked. That's what mattered. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I wasn't worthy. It was an extremely hurtful feeling as I had worked so hard to fit into David's world, but that was the intention. Unbeknownst to me, every conversation that I'd had with David was laced with ammunition that could be used against me at any other point in time. I had no idea that David derived pleasure from the emotional snapback. Correction. I had no idea that David derived pleasure from subjecting me to the emotional snapback. I guess I was working under the assumption that I was exempt. The point was for it to sting, and it did. It was the first time, but certainly not the last. Everything that I said could and would be used against me. That's how David operated. After verbally and physically abusing me, David returned and addressed Juanita. I think I'd like duck breasts and asparagus for dinner. I interjected, hoping that Juanita wouldn't have to be subjected to an uncomfortable exchange with him. I said, "We don't have duck breasts here." David turned his attention to me. He said, "Well, go and get some, and hurry, because I would like for dinner to be ready at 7:30. Chapter 14, The Trap. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. And that was the beginning of my married life with David. It really did start off that small. Let me clarify that statement. Getting slapped is certainly not diminutive, and there was certainly some mental abuse in play. But all things considered, it was a far cry from where things eventually ended up. Most days were pretty good in the beginning. David and I went to work during the day, leaving Juanita to take care of the house in our absence. All was well. Juanita was everything we knew she'd be, even more. She cleaned the house to my exacting standards, and she cooked everything to David's specifications. That was a big thing with him. David was very specific about how he liked his food, and my heavy seasoning wasn't always a hit. But Juanita's time in the service industry made her extremely catering. She did everything exactly as we liked it. David and I didn't even fix our own bed. On average, David and I left home around 8 a.m. I was usually home by 6. David's schedule was far less predictable. It really depended on a variety of factors. The first factor was work. We never knew if David would be home on time or if he would be working late. He was a lawyer, and cases often mandated that he worked after typical business hours. That was to be expected. But the other factor wasn't as easy to understand. The second factor was Sean. David and Sean both blamed me for the demise of his marriage to Tina. Consequently, when Sean was feeling down, the male members of the legal group went to the bar after work. Without the women, Sean couldn't boil water. Thus, he frequented restaurants. When he didn't feel like eating out, he ate dinner with us. Sean didn't speak to me unless it was absolutely necessary. By David's logic, he wouldn't feel obligated to be cordial to someone who had single-handedly broken up his marriage either. Consequently, he let it be known that Sean owed me nothing, not even a conversation. That was the first time that David had ever joined someone else in being adversarial towards me. It was extremely hurtful. Neither of them ever acknowledged that Sean's behavior was the catalyst for Tina's decision to divorce him. That wasn't even up for consideration. It was all on me. And bad news travels fast in those circles. Chad advised Mandy that she was not to be in my company unless he was also around. Unbeknownst to Chad, I had advised Mandy to leave him after every single cheating episode. Considering how things played out with Sean and Tina, I guess I was glad she hadn't taken my advice. It seemed that David, Sean, and Chad had formulated a weird alliance against the women in their lives. My actions had somehow resulted in a universal punishment for us all. All consideration for the women went out of the window. The crazy thing is, David never told us when he'd be late. We just figured it out when he wasn't there on time. Even crazier, I usually conversed with David throughout the day, and he never mentioned the possibility that he may be late. He just failed to show up. Nonetheless, he still expected dinner to be ready at 7:30, whether he was there to eat it or not. It all seems so obvious now. Respect is a minimum expectation in any relationship. As a simple measure of respect, David could have placed a phone call to inform me that he would be late. If for no other reason, David's own mandates on time management should have made him feel that a phone call was necessary, but that was the point. David was showing me that he didn't think I was worthy of the respect that he dedicated to most other things. I took each individual occurrence as an isolated incident, never realizing that David was adding everything together. He was seeing how far he could go, and I didn't realize that. That was unfortunate for me. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20. Nonetheless, David and I carried on with our lives, and for the most part, he treated me fairly well. With the mindset that I had at the time, I could really have tolerated David. He was an amazing provider. I was aware that I didn't have to work. And outside of that first day home from Belize, David hadn't laid a finger on me. He continued to provide the most amazing experiences, and we presented a united front in every area that mattered. The problem? I hated the way he treated Juanita. Belize David loved Juanita. Home David, not so much. I was under the impression that Juanita would be like family that just happened to cook, clean, and sleep with us on occasion. It should have been an arrangement that worked out for all parties involved, but it didn't work for Juanita, and by default, it didn't work for me either. David paid Juanita in the beginning, but after a while, he insisted that we owed her nothing. According to David, we had saved Juanita from a life of poverty. He told her that living with us was payment enough. And it wasn't just the words. It was the dismissive way in which he said them, as if he didn't think that she was worthy of further explanation. I hated that he was comfortable making her feel that way. I started to pay Juanita out of my own pocket, behind David's back, of course. That was only fair. Additionally, David really was quite cruel to Juanita. He didn't address her unless he was ordering her to do something. David didn't talk to Juanita, he talked at her. It reminded me of how he treated the staff at the places we visited. He was very dismissive towards her, and I hated that. It was always, go do this or go do that. He made her wait on us hand and foot. I felt guilty in the same way that I did when Antonio started to be dismissive towards Peaches and Cream. It really was quite disrespectful. And if that wasn't enough, David allowed our friends and acquaintances to be verbally abusive towards her as well. Sean never addressed Juanita by her name. He always called her girl, and David never objected. It was obvious that David derived pleasure from creating discomfort. Although Juanita was present in the morning and David clearly could have had conversations with her, he chose to leave her detailed notes in sealed envelopes. Each day, Juanita was forced to read the note to discover what he requested of her. I was very much aware that it made Juanita uncomfortable, as reading wasn't her strong suit. It probably wouldn't have been as insulting if she was allowed to read the notes at her leisure, but David added an additional layer of insult by insisting that she read them aloud. Every morning, Juanita was required to stand in front of us while we ate our breakfast. On each occasion, David laughed boisterously as he watched Juanita struggle to read the excessively worded notes that he left. I hated it, yet I said nothing, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. The Belize sex was non-existent. We all still took pills and we still had sex, but it definitely wasn't the same, not even close. While David was still passionate towards me, he was somewhat brutal with Juanita. It wasn't quite rape, but it was rough and uncaring. He made it obvious that he had no respect for her. I didn't interact much with Juanita during sex. She wasn't enjoying it, and I could tell. How could I do that to her? I couldn't. Yet, I said nothing. The situation with Juanita took me back to a conversation that I'd had with Antonio years earlier. With all the information about drug addiction, I wondered how so many people still found themselves in that predicament. In typical Antonio fashion, he broke it down to me in a way that only he could. He said, "This is the thing, little girl. Everybody is chasing something. People like me and you chase money. That's what we do. But it's different for them. People who do drugs are chasing a feeling. It's the feeling that they had the very first time they tried that drug, a feeling that they most likely won't ever experience again. Yet, they'll continue to try. It's our job to give them the promise of the feeling that they're chasing, because that gives us the money that we're chasing. It's like a rabbit trap. Rabbit traps are effective because they're easy to get into and nearly impossible to get out of. The rabbit sees something inviting inside of the trap and they are lured in. Once inside, the owner of the trap can use the situation as he sees fit. He can feed the rabbit until he's ready to use it, or he can dispose of it otherwise. Either way, the choice is his. Have you ever wondered why some drug dealers are willing to give the first hit for free? Because that's the nature of the trap. You lure them in with the promise of a good feeling for free. Once inside of the trap, it's almost impossible to get out. Once you've developed an addict, you have a steady stream of income from them. You also have someone who will do your bidding for little more than what you can afford to give away for free. Why? Because they're chasing that feeling. That's the trap. And that's when it became apparent to me. David had trapped Juanita. He lured her to the United States with the promise of something wonderful. He knew that she was chasing a better life, and he presented an avenue for her to receive it. As far as David was concerned, Juanita was trapped. By his logic, he had taken away any possibility that Juanita could sustain life without his assistance. And since she was trapped, David used the situation as he saw fit. He used Juanita's need to be stable as fuel for his narcissism. I felt that he was just waiting it all out until he decided if he wanted to eat the rabbit or dispose of it otherwise, neither of which would be beneficial for Juanita. I felt horrible about Juanita's predicament, but I also felt powerless to change her situation. What could I do? Send her away? Where would she go? Back to Belize to host the tourist season? Back to Guatemala, where she had dirt floors and no running water? I knew she didn't want to live like that, and I didn't want her to. After weighing it all out, she was better off there. She was better off with me. And David. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shinny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome.